What's up, my Canadian cousins? It is so good to see you guys again. It's been over a week since I shot a video, and that's actually, I think, the longest stretch I've gone since I started the channel. But you know, life got very busy with my day job, and I got very busy with my children, and etc., etc., etc. So today we're going to take a look at a topic that has been on my list since the very early days of the channel, a few 4 or 5 months ago. Why the Dutch love Canadians. And I kind of know why. You know, this was suggested to me within the context of a video I did on why Canadians change when they hear war, the word war. And so this was in the context of the World Wars, World War II in particular. I know that the Dutch liberated the Netherlands, or for the most part in 1945, towards the end of the war, while they were starving in utter misery. So just for some very, very brief historical context, in 1944, after the Normandy landings were successful and the Allies were pushing through France, British General Montgomery had a idea that he thought he could end the war earlier. You know, the Allied command's main focus was a long front that would push very broadly towards Germany from France and into Germany to liberate all of France and to try to push in that way. But Montgomery had an idea that he could end the war earlier by almost doing the reverse of what the British did, of what the Germans did by coming through Holland and Belgium with Blitzkrieg to try to get to Germany earlier by liberating the Netherlands and pushing over the Rhine into the heartland of German industrial production, and shut that down, and then straight into Berlin. So there was a plan that was overly ambitious, that relied on, it was very complicated and relied on every single thing going right. It was called Operation Market Garden, whereby British paratroopers, Polish paratroopers landed far into the Netherlands in the city of Arnhem, and there were several bridges that needed to be captured, and there were also going to be some U.S. airborne divisions, and then a large part of the United States Army pushing up from the south on the roads with tanks and with infantry support, capture bridge by bridge by bridge, and then link up. There was faulty intelligence. Well, actually, I should say there was intelligence that was ignored by the British, even though there were some whistleblowers about the German strength in the Netherlands at that point, and how many tanks they actually still had there. To make a long story short, it did not succeed. Famously, it was a bridge too far, the city of Arnhem. And a lot of Allied soldiers lost their lives, and they did not really accomplish much other than to liberate part of the Netherlands in the south. I think southwest, the city of Eindhoven was liberated. But most of the Netherlands remained under German occupation for almost the rest of the war. And because the Dutch thought they were being liberated, they, especially the Dutch underground, fought and supported the Allied attempt during Operation Market Garden. There were reprisals, and some of the reprisals were to deprive the Dutch of basic human necessities such as food. Moreover, because Germany was losing the war and they were becoming desperate, they were diverting all resources, including food, from occupied territories into Germany. And so the Dutch suffered terribly from the reprisals, from the deprivation of food. They were absolutely starving. If you've ever watched video of it, it's terrible. They look like they come from a famine-stricken land. Within that context, in 1945, the Canadians, against stiff German resistance, liberated the Netherlands, and many, many Canadian lives were lost. And more than that, once they liberated the Netherlands, they also partook in the process of providing immediate aid and solace to the Dutch, setting up supply chains to get them food, first and foremost, shelter, medical care, and all of that. And so that's why I know that the Dutch have a strong place in their heart for Canada. And I think that's where this video is going to go. But, you know, the details are what I really love to learn, because I know this all in the abstract from reading, from watching some documentaries from afar, but I don't really ever get the perspective of, you know, a specific documentary on the topic, especially coming from Canada or coming from the Netherlands. I'm not sure. Oh, this is definitely from Canada because it's the CBC National program. So, okay, I've spoken far too much. Let's get to the video, and I will see you, my friends, on the flip side.
The Netherlands in the spring. Beautiful. Flowers in full bloom, parks pristine, streets spotless. It's a far cry from what the same spots were like 70 years ago. The Germans had leveled the cities, murdered those who got in the way, and sent tens of thousands of Jews to be gassed in death camps. The Dutch who were left were starving after the 5 years of brutal Nazi occupation. By 1945, they were so hungry, some were eating tulip bulbs to stay alive.
My God, look. That child. I mean, I didn't actually mean to pause on that image. It's powerful. It's disturbing. It's sad. I just want to pick that child up and cradle him or her. I can't even tell. But why I paused was, you know, they mentioned the, very quickly, all the deportation of the Dutch Jews. And it just brings to mind the Diary of Anne Frank. If you've ever read that, she was Dutch, a Dutch Jew. And famously were hidden up in the attic of this building, the hidden annex with another family. So beautiful and touching, but you understand that ultimately she was one of the people. I mean, the Nazis discovered her and her family. Her father lives, but I think everyone else died, including her.
The rickets-ridden bodies of this Dutch family are witnesses to the treatment the Germans meted out to our friends in Holland.
That's when the Canadians arrived, blasting their way into towns like this one, Apeldoorn, crushing the Nazis, liberating the people.
Thank God.
The Dutch have never forgotten, never. And this week, they'll be in these streets again, by the thousands, to welcome back some of those Canadians, now in their 90s, who gave them their country, their lives back. I've been coming here for 20 years, never ceasing to be amazed at the Dutch determination to say thank you. The street with its pennants and Canadian flags is represented.
So I'm really happy. As soon as I heard this gentleman's voice, Peter Mansbridge, I really, really like him. Really like him. He's been great. I've watched his interview with Gord Downey that was so hard at the end of Gord's life. I've watched he did the piece on Vimy Ridge. I've just really, really grown to love this guy. But I've never seen him this young. So this was 1995 that this particular segment of this video is, and look at him. Oh, all right.
Of many streets across the Netherlands right now, as the Dutch mark the major contribution that Canada played in the liberation of their country half a century ago.
I'm very young. I only heard stories from my grandfather and grandmother. But yes, they freed us 50 years ago, so that's why I'm here.
I think it's a love affair between the Canadians and the Dutch.
Well, 60 years is an awfully long time, but not long
Here's
enough
Peter
for
10
the
years
Dutch
later.
to forget the pain, the loss, the suffering, and the oppression of living under Nazi rule all those years during the Second World War. And not long enough either to forget the liberation and those who brought it to them.
It's a beautiful day. This is out of this world.
I'm feeling liberated.
107,000 people left this place on the trains destined for the death camps of Nazi-occupied Europe. 102,000 of them perished in those camps. On days like this, the Dutch come to remember what happened here more than 65 years ago.
The camp life was dominated by the train. The train was taking away 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 prisoners, and you prayed being not on the list.
Why do they never forget? Just listen to some of the stories we've heard over the years.
And I said, do you eat that every day? Sure. You want some? I'll give you a whole loaf. A whole loaf of white bread. I ran to the house and I planted it on the breakfast table and I said, here, look at it. Canadians are here.
Look at this street sign in an Apeldoorn suburb. If the name looks Canadian, it's because it is. A dozen streets in this neighborhood are named after one of the almost 8,000 Canadians who never came home from the battle. What was it about those young men who, through the generations, the Dutch won't stop thanking? Who were those guys? George Beale was one of them, a major with the 48th Highlanders. Every few days he'd stop and write a letter home to his wife, Ruth, in Toronto.
Were the Highlanders a Nova Scotia division? I'm only asking because obviously that is taken from the British-Scottish Highlanders, and I would imagine that the tradition transferred over across the Atlantic, the Scottish tradition of that. Just curiosity.
This is one of them. Here's what he said. My own darling, I haven't written you for 5 days. I didn't feel much like it, sweetie, as we were fighting again, and I was awfully busy, and we've been having a tough fight. At the moment, I'm sitting in a city called Apeldoorn, and the Queen's Palace is within 100 yards of me. That's the Queen's Palace, right over there. We're about 100 yards from it. He might have been right here. We entered the town proper this morning after a big advance from the Isle River. I'm fine, Ruth, so don't worry, although I'm very tired. The enemy's running like the...
You see all that water they're showing there. I know that when the Germans were retreating, they flooded because the Netherlands is a large part of it, at least. I don't know all the details, is below sea level, and so they use a system of dams and dikes to keep from getting flooded, and the Germans purposefully flooded the territory that the Canadians were going to have to advance over to make it much harder.
Devil again, and we have to chase him. The fighting was
Back
bloody.
up a second, because I interrupted.
So don't worry, although I'm very tired. The enemy's running like the devil again, and we have to chase him. The fighting was bloody, and the dying. But through it all, George wrote to Ruth about the love he had for his men. He wrote this one on Sunday, April 22nd. I have fought and lived with those men for over a year, and to me they seemed as though they were part of my family. They never refused to go any place I ordered, and did everything I asked them to, cheerfully and willingly, knowing most of the time that I might be sending them to their deaths. There were lots of individual Canadian heroes here, Army men like George Beale, but Air Force flyers too. 50 years ago, these fields near Nistelrode in southeastern Holland were home base for a Royal Canadian Air Force Spitfire squadron. One of those Canadian pilots was a 22-year-old chap from Lethbridge, Alberta, whose name was Richard Odette. Well, near the end of December 1944, Odette had flown more than 50 missions. But up until that point, he had scored no German kills. Well, on the 29th of December, 1944, all that changed. When Richard Odette flew out of one of these fields, he flew right into the history books. Before he returned, he had shot down 5 German aircraft. No other Canadian pilot, no other British pilot had scored that many victories in one mission.
Goodness.
Meanwhile, frontline fighters broke through to capture key strategic locations. All this was happening as the Nazis were facing their final desperate days, until that last moment when the fighting and the dying suddenly stopped. 70 years ago this week, the war ended. And here's what George Beale wrote to Ruth on that same day. You
70 years ago, so it was 2005.
The emotion in his voice. Darling, you couldn't possibly have any idea just what kind of a reception it has been and still is. The people go simply mad. And I had the honor, darling, of being the leading vehicle, my Jeep. Any town we went through,
2015, I'm sorry.
roads, and we had a most difficult time getting past them. They all want to touch your hand or even kiss you, and they simply pelted us with flowers. My Jeep looked like a florist shop. It does make all the hardships worthwhile when you see the joy of these liberated people.
Beautiful.
For this year's returning heroes, new medals from the local mayor.
Your memories, your thoughts guide us as we shape our future.
And new thoughts about an old battle.
Well, I was stationed here during the war as a Canadian Women's Army Corps, which I'm very proud of.
You should be.
And it brings back so many memories. And I always have a place in my heart for Holland, for Apeldoorn.
And it's a great, great day, you know. For the little thing we did, we get so much, 1,000 times more time.
The Dutch people are so
The Dutch people are the
faithful to
best
us.
people in the world, and I mean it.
Even from then until now, 2015 until now, I'm sure a lot of these people have moved on. There are so few left. And, you know, it was great to be able to honor them like this during their lifetimes.
Wangeningen just down the road from Apeldoorn, in that little building. That's where the Germans finally surrendered. These extraordinary pictures capture the moment.
To the Commander-in-Chief, 21 Army Group. These forces to lay down their arms and to surrender unconditionally.
And there at the table, Canadian General George Kitching, distinguished then and just as distinguished when I chatted with him at the same table 50 years later. How do you feel when you come back?
Wow.
It's almost as if they're ghosts, as if you are the German on the opposite side of the table, Peter. It was full of people then. Any movement, it was a very quiet room. And in spite of the fact that there were 30 Canadian reporters, they were quiet.
The general is gone now, and so are many of the men who fought with him.
Yeah, look at him. So he looked to be in his middle age, maybe his 40s at some point during the war, and in 95 he was an older gentleman, completely with it. Curious, his accent almost sounded a bit more British. But then again, in the 1940s, even some like upper crust New Yorker's accent almost sounded a little bit more British. If you think about Franklin Roosevelt, it was sort of this transatlantic accent that was a bit of a mixture of English style speak and North American speak. So I wonder if that's a similar trait that certain Canadians have, or maybe he was born in Britain and was raised in Canada. I don't know. Just an interesting afterthought for me.
But the ones who are left, the ones who still come, the ones the Dutch, young and old, still so adore, are here with their memories. The ones that hurt, the ones that leave them quiet, and the ones that somehow make them smile.
I've never felt that I sacrificed anything to be part of a liberating army.
There were so many Canadians who lost their lives here in the Netherlands. How did you handle that on a day-to-day basis?
I put it out of my mind altogether. but nonetheless I cry when I go to the cemetery and see my friends' graves.
I never learned to cry. You just feel it inside.
What does it mean to you guys to be remembered the way you are here in this country, the way they look at you, the way they react to you?
It's 70 years ago that we were here, but still, the kids are still enthusiastic about what we did here 70 years ago, and I love to see kids the way they greet us and the way they look in such admiration at us, you know.
Really, it was something to feel the happiness, the joy of the liberation.
I asked the people I was staying with, what is this touching bit, you know? They asked permission to touch you, and I couldn't get over that, so they want to touch a liberator, and they want their children to touch a liberator.
20 years ago, I asked
There is something about that. I mean, you know, these are living human beings who were actual liberators. But there's something about having a tactile experience with something to really draw you in. You know, there are a lot of buildings, of course, that are hundreds or even thousands of years old. You know, old bits of history. You know, a place where, in the United States, for example, Independence Hall, where they declared independence and where the U.S. Constitution was debated and constructed. You know, you go into that building and you touch the railings and you touch the bars and you touch whatever you touch and you say, I'm touching something physical that existed during that time, that those people, those famous people throughout history touched themselves, and they're just, it brings you to it. The sense of smell does that too. So to touch the living liberator, you know, the people that gave you back your freedom. And I would think that that's even, you know, I have no idea what it's like to live under those conditions in an occupied country, but my thoughts are that it may have been even a little harder for people like the Dutch and the French who had freedom, who enjoyed freedom, and then it was taken away and now given back, because they truly knew what they lost, and it was given back. And not only that, they were dying and starving. And so, I mean, literally their lives were saved by this, not just their freedoms, their lives.
Then Mayor of Apeldoorn, why it was that the Dutch never forgot the Canadians. His answer was very simple, very direct. He said, you have to have been occupied to appreciate what freedom really means. And when you do, you never forget who gave it to you. That's why Canada is never forgotten here. Never.
Similar to what I just said, other than that they were free beforehand, so they were occupied after having lost their freedom. Yeah, I guess that's the basic sentiment. Well, my friends, you know, again, thank you once again for your brilliant suggestions. It's so really sweet and heartwarming to know that the Dutch continue to feel that way towards Canada. And I suspect that it's easy to continue to feel that affinity towards Canada because you share, I believe, a lot of the same values. You know, as the majority of society shares a lot of the same values, which probably helps you stay, helps your feelings of camaraderie and affinity remain vibrant all these years, never forgetting what Canada did for the Netherlands. Yeah, very, very, very poignant stuff. Important to remember in history. And you know, I do these, and obviously I have an interest in the world wars, seminal events. Of course, during our history, God can only say what the world would have been like had those wars turned out differently. But I don't ever lose sight about the horrors of war, and these stories of heroism are great. but we can't ever forget that they happened in the midst of terrible human suffering. Civilians were suffered more during World War II probably than in any other war that there was. I believe that that's the case. In raw numbers, maybe not proportional to populations, but in raw numbers. And the soldiers and the families of all those who died, who were sacrificed, who were murdered, and who gave their lives. That's why I really like these stories. That's why I really like it, because they never make me stop feeling something. They never make me stop feeling something powerful and something strong. So anyway, those are my reflections for what they're worth. Thank you, my friends. I will see you soon. Take care.